The Luftwaffe pilots who first spotted the Bristol Beaufighter in combat during late 1940 did what any experienced aviator would do. They sized up their opponent. What they saw didn't particularly concern them. The aircraft was enormous by fighter standards, with a fuselage that looked bloated compared to the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-110 it was meant to challenge. Its twin engines gave it a purposeful look, certainly, but the sheer bulk suggested something agricultural, perhaps even clumsy. German intelligence reports from early encounters described it as heavy and ponderous in turning circles, lacking the acrobatic grace of single-engine fighters. Some Luftwaffe crews began referring to it dismissively, assuming they could simply outmaneuver this British newcomer if it dared to engage. That confidence lasted precisely until the first burst of fire. What those German pilots couldn't see from external observation was the arrangement of weaponry clustered in the Beaufighter's belly. 4 Hispano Mark II cannons, each 20 mm in bore diameter, were mounted in a tight grouping beneath the forward fuselage. This wasn't a scattered arrangement like some aircraft carried, with guns spread across wings where convergence patterns created gaps. These 4 cannons fired in near parallel, creating a cone of destruction roughly 1 meter wide at 250 meters distance. When a Beaufighter pilot squeezed his trigger, he didn't spray bullets. He projected a solid wall of explosive shells. The Hispano cannon fired a shell weighing roughly 130 grams at around 880 meters per second. Each shell contained a high explosive incendiary charge that detonated on impact. Now multiply that by 4 cannons, each cycling at around 600 rounds per minute. In a 2-second burst, the typical firing duration in combat, a Beaufighter pumped approximately 80 shells into the airspace ahead. 80 explosive projectiles, each capable of punching through aluminium airframes, severing control cables, igniting fuel tanks, or simply dismembering aircraft structures. German bomber crews flying Heinkel, He-111s and Junkers, Ju-88s learned this mathematics the hard way. A Dornier Do-17 might absorb dozens of rifle-caliber bullets and limp home with a patched fuselage. It could not absorb 4 20mm cannons firing simultaneously. The first Beaufighter victories weren't dogfights in the traditional sense. They were executions. Bomber crews reported seeing the twin-engine fighter closing from behind or below, seemingly too slow to worry about, and then their aircraft simply disintegrated. Wings folded upward as spars were severed. Fuselages broke in half. Engine nacelles erupted in flames that consumed entire wings in seconds. One Luftwaffe pilot who survived being attacked by a Beaufighter over the English Channel in March 1941 described the experience in his debriefing. He'd been flying as wingman in a formation of Ju-88s, returning from a raid when the Beaufighter appeared below them, climbing. He assumed they had time to take evasive action. The British fighter opened fire at what seemed like excessive range, over 300 meters, and his commander's aircraft ahead simply exploded. Not caught fire, not trailing smoke, exploded as if hit by anti-aircraft artillery. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 4 seconds. That's what changed the equation. The Beaufighter didn't need to be nimble when its targets disappeared in a single firing pass. The reason Bristol designed such a devastating weapons platform had everything to do with Britain's strategic predicament in the spring and summer of 1940. The RAF faced multiple crises simultaneously. Bomber Command needed long-range escorts that could accompany raids deep into occupied Europe, a role the short-legged Spitfire and Hurricane couldn't fulfill. Coastal Command desperately wanted aircraft capable of hunting U-boats and protecting shipping lanes far out into the Atlantic, beyond where single-engine fighters could venture. Fighter Command, meanwhile, was clamoring for night fighters that could carry the new airborne interception radar sets being developed, equipment too bulky and heavy for existing airframes. The traditional solution would involve designing an entirely new aircraft from scratch, a process that typically consumed 3 to 4 years, from drawing board to squadron service. Britain didn't have 3 years. France had just fallen. The Luftwaffe was preparing for what would become the Blitz. The Air Ministry needed a solution immediately, ideally yesterday. Leslie Fries, Bristol's chief designer, had made a decision that seemed almost reckless in its pragmatism. He would build a fighter using components that already existed and were in production. The wings would come directly from the Beaufort torpedo bomber, a design already flying and being manufactured. The tail assembly would be borrowed from the Blenheim light bomber. The engines would be Hercules radials, again already in production for other aircraft types. Even the landing gear would be adapted from existing designs rather than engineered from nothing. This wasn't elegant engineering in the traditional sense. It was architectural salvage applied to aircraft design. But it was fast. Fries's team began work in October 1939, and the first prototype flew on July 17, 1940, 9 months from concept to flying aircraft. For context, the Messerschmitt Bf 110, Germany's premier heavy fighter, had taken nearly 3 years from initial design to operational service. The Beaufort wings brought an unexpected advantage. They were designed to carry a torpedo weighing nearly 900 kilograms beneath the fuselage, which meant they had structural strength far beyond what a typical fighter required. That robust structure could easily handle the weight and recoil forces of 4 20mm cannons plus 6 machine guns in the wings. The spacious fuselage, necessary because they'd simply stretched a Beaufort's basic design, provided room for radar equipment, a navigator radar operator position, and enormous fuel tanks that gave the aircraft a range exceeding 2,500 kilometers. Bristol essentially created a fighter by accident of reusing bomber components. The Beaufighter was large because bombers are large. It was sturdy because torpedo bombers must be sturdy. It had long range because maritime patrol aircraft need long range. None of this was optimized for traditional fighter combat, but then again, the Beaufighter wasn't being asked to dogfight Messerschmitt Bf 109s over the Channel. The first operational squadron, number 25, received their Beaufighters in September 1940, barely 14 months after design work began. They were flying combat missions by the end of that month. From concept to combat in just over a year, it was unprecedented, and it was exactly what Britain needed when German bombers were pulverizing cities nightly. The decision to mount 4 Hispano cannons in the belly, rather than spreading them across the wings, represented a fundamental philosophical shift in aerial gunnery. Most contemporary fighters distributed their weapons across the airframe to avoid excessive weight in any single location. The Spitfire, for instance, carried its 8 machine guns spread across both wings. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 mounted 2 cowling guns and 2 or 3 wing-mounted cannons. This distribution seemed logical from an engineering perspective. It balanced the aircraft and prevented structural stress concentration. But distribution created a problem called convergence. Wing-mounted guns had to be angled slightly inward so their fire patterns intersected at a specific distance, typically between 200 and 300 meters. Fire your guns closer than that convergence point, and the bullets passed on either side of the target. Fire beyond it, and they diverged again. You had a narrow window where all weapons actually hit the same spot. The Beaufighter eliminated this entirely. Its 4 Hispano cannons sat in a box-like housing beneath the cockpit, all 4 barrels parallel and separated by mere centimeters. There was no convergence angle because there was nothing to converge. The shells flew in an almost cylindrical pattern. A pilot aiming at a target at 100 meters was putting shells into the same space as a pilot firing at 400 meters. The cone of fire widened slightly with distance due to minute barrel vibrations and ammunition inconsistencies, but the effect was negligible compared to wing-mounted weapons. This tight grouping multiplied the destructive effect exponentially. Imagine 4 explosive shells arriving within a dinner plate-sized area simultaneously. The first shell might penetrate the skin of a bomber. The second, arriving milliseconds later, detonated against already weakened structure. The third found the hole the previous 2 had created and penetrated deeper into the aircraft's internals. The fourth followed through the gap and exploded inside a fuel tank or ammunition bay. It was sequential demolition happening so rapidly it appeared instantaneous. The Hispano Mark II cannon itself was a weapon of considerable sophistication. Originally a French design by Hispano Suiza, it had been licensed and manufactured in Britain with modifications for better reliability. Each cannon weighed approximately 42 kilograms and measured roughly 2.5 meters long. The shells came in several varieties: high explosive incendiary, semi-armor piercing incendiary, and practice rounds. The high explosive incendiary variant, most commonly used against aircraft, contained roughly 11 grams of explosive compound, enough to create devastating fragmentation effects against aluminium structures. The rate of fire meant that during a typical 2-second burst, 16 to 20 shells from each cannon reached the target, between 64 and 80 total projectiles. To put this in perspective, the combined weight of explosive delivered in 2 seconds exceeded what many light bombers dropped in a single attack run. The Beaufighter was essentially a flying artillery piece. 6 additional machine guns supplemented the cannons, 4 Browning .303-inch weapons in the wings and 2 more in the right wing's outer section on some variants. These machine guns weren't the primary armament, they were psychological weapons. Tracer rounds from the Brownings showed the pilot where his fire was going, helping him correct his aim. They also forced enemy gunners to duck instinctively, suppressing return fire during the crucial seconds when the Beaufighter closed to lethal cannon range. Luftwaffe crews quickly learned to identify the Beaufighter by the pattern of its attack. You saw tracers first, the machine gun rounds creating bright streaks in the darkness. Then came the cannons, and by then it was far too late to do anything except hope. German military intelligence, the Luftwaffe's Nachrichtenverbindung, prided itself on thorough aircraft assessment. When fragments of a Beaufighter were recovered from a crash site near Dover in November 1940, the analysis team did what they always did: measured, weighed, and calculated. The wingspan came in at 17.63 meters, significantly larger than the Bf-110's 16.3 meters. The fuselage measured 12.7 meters, bulky and cylindrical. Most telling was the estimated weight, approximately 6,800 kilograms empty, nearly 9,500 kilograms loaded for combat. The analysts did their mathematics and reached what seemed like an obvious conclusion. An aircraft this heavy, with this much drag, couldn't possibly be maneuverable. The report that circulated through Luftwaffe units in early 1941 categorized the Beaufighter as a heavy fighter, with emphasis on the word heavy. It noted the twin Hercules engines produced substantial power, approximately 1,400 horsepower each, but concluded that this power was absorbed by the aircraft's mass and drag. Maximum speed was estimated at roughly 515 kilometers per hour, slower than the Bf-110's reported 560. What the analysis missed entirely was that maneuverability and combat effectiveness weren't synonymous, especially at night. The German assessments focused on turning radius, roll rate, and acceleration, metrics that mattered in daylight dogfighting between single-engine fighters. Nobody at the Intelligence Directorate apparently considered that an aircraft hunting bombers, at night, had different requirements. A Beaufighter didn't need to outturn a Heinkel. It needed to get within 300 meters without being detected, achieve a stable firing position for 2 seconds, and survive any return fire long enough to escape. The flawed assessment spread through bomber units as tactical briefings. Crews were told that if intercepted by a Beaufighter, they should attempt tight turns, as the heavy British fighter supposedly couldn't follow. Several Junkers Ju-88 crews tried exactly that in early 1941 and discovered the advice was lethal. The Beaufighter might not follow through a violent banking turn, but it didn't need to. Its pilot simply waited for the bomber to complete its turn and stabilize, then fired into the predictable flight path. The few extra seconds the bomber spent maneuvering achieved nothing, except making it an easier target when it finally straightened out. A more perceptive analysis would have noted the Beaufighter's actual tactical advantages. Its size meant it could carry the AI Mark IV radar, a bulky apparatus that weighed approximately 90 kilograms and required a dedicated operator. Smaller fighters couldn't accommodate this equipment. The spacious fuselage allowed the radar operator to work effectively, calling out ranges and bearings to guide the pilot onto targets in total darkness. The Germans knew about airborne radar. Their own Liechtenstein system was under development, but they failed to connect the Beaufighter's size with its capability to carry sophisticated electronics. The structural strength that came from using Beaufort bomber wings meant the Beaufighter could dive at high speeds without risking structural failure. Several Luftwaffe crews reported being attacked by Beaufighters that dove from above at terrifying velocities, fired a burst, then used their speed to escape before defensive gunners could react. German intelligence dismissed these reports as exaggerations born of combat stress, insisting the Beaufighter's weight would make such tactics impossible. By mid-1941, Luftwaffe loss reports showed a disturbing pattern. Bombers were disappearing over Britain with no radio contact, no distress calls, simply vanishing from formations in darkness. When wreckage was later examined, the damage showed massive structural failure consistent with large caliber cannon fire, yet the official assessment of the Beaufighter remained unchanged. Heavy, slow, avoid if possible, but not particularly dangerous if engaged properly. The truth emerged in the night skies over England throughout the winter of 1940 and into 1941. The Blitz was at its peak, with Luftwaffe bomber streams crossing the Channel in darkness, navigating by radio beams to hit cities from London to Liverpool. British night defences had been largely ineffective. Searchlights swept empty sky, anti-aircraft guns fired at sounds, and single-engine fighters groped blindly through the darkness, hoping to stumble across enemy aircraft. The odds of interception were abysmal. Roughly 2% of German bombers encountered any opposition whatsoever. The Beaufighter changed this calculus completely when paired with AI Mark IV radar. The system worked by transmitting radio pulses and detecting reflections from metal objects, aircraft. The radar operator sat behind the pilot, watching a cathode ray tube display roughly 20 centimeters across. Targets appeared as blips of light, with range indicated by their position on the screen. Maximum detection range varied wildly depending on atmospheric conditions, but typically reached 4 to 8 kilometers for bomber-sized targets. The process of interception became methodical rather than random. Ground controllers guided the Beaufighter into the general area of bomber activity using information from chain-home radar stations. Once within range, the airborne radar operator took over, calling out bearings and distances. The pilot adjusted course accordingly, closing the gap while remaining below and behind the target, outside the bomber's gunner's field of view. At around 300 meters, the pilot typically gained